It's nice to be back and see everyone and familiar faces as well. So that's lovely. If you have a face, it would be nice to see it. As I always say, thank you, Rosanna, for joining us. As Michael was saying, we're just gonna jump right in and start with our case study for today by Ernst Kris that we'll read today and we will engage with today. We are doing this in order to learn something about the meaning of reality in psychoanalysis. But I mean, this is not the common conception, the common meaning of reality. As you all know, if you have a Twitter and have some, let's say, psychoanalyst friends, some of them will speak about reality principle and the fact that many patients have to succumb to it. But then the question is, what does this exactly mean? And we spent an hour and a half, I think, talking about this last time. I think it was a very interesting session. If you missed it, it's okay. We're not going to delve deeply into exactly what we talked about last time. It would be good if you were here. And you can also find it on YouTube. So even if you missed it, it's already on YouTube. You can watch our first session there. And we're going to have a third session as well. Maybe a fourth. We'll see. Depends how you guys will feel. Just to begin, I'd like to ask someone with a better English accent than myself to read out the case. So it could be anyone. We did that last time as well, having some reading assignments from time to time. So if anyone would like to do that, I would appreciate that greatly. It's a few paragraphs. Again, for those joining in at this point, I'll just say about the Zoom silence. I don't think you're going to beat me with that. First of all, I've had 2 years of teaching on Zoom, so I'm used to it. But also I teach in Germany, and students in Germany take a long time until they start up their engines. So I'm used to it. I just open a book or something and wait for someone to volunteer. But Luis, you did it very quickly. Where are you joining us from?
I'm from Mexico right now. It's 11 a.m., so it's quite early for me.
Okay, that's true. Fantastic. So it's you're fresh, you're ready?
At the time of his second analysis, a patient who was young scientist in his early 30s successfully filled a respected academic position without being able to advance to higher rank because he wasn't able to publish any of his extensive researches. This, his chief complaint, led him to seek further analysis. He remembered with gratitude the previous treatment which had improved his potency, diminished social inhibitions, producing a marked change in his life, and he was anxious that his resumption of analysis should not come to the notice of his previous analyst, a woman, lest she feel in any way hurt by his not returning to her. But he was convinced that after a lapse of years, he should now be analyzed by a man. He had learned in his first analysis that fear and guilt prevented him from being productive, that he always wanted to steal as he had done in puberty. He was under constant pressure of an impulse to use somebody else's ideas, frequently those of a distinguished young scholar, his intimate friend whose office was adjacent to his own and with whom he engaged daily in long conversations.
Everyone with us until here? Thank you, Luis. I think you're reading very nicely. Good. So let's carry on.
All right. Oh, I lost the page. So sorry. Okay. Soon, a concrete plan for work and publication was about to materialize when one day the patient reported he had just discovered in the library a treatise published years ago in which the same basic idea was developed. It was a treatise with which he had been familiar since he had glanced at it some time ago. His paradoxical tone of satisfaction, of excitement, led me to inquire in very great detail about the text he was afraid to plagiarize. In a process of extended scrutiny, it turned out that the old publication contained useful support of his thesis, but no hint of the thesis itself. The patient had made the author say what he wanted to say himself. Once this clue was secured, the whole problem of plagiarism appeared in a new light. The eminent colleague, it transpired, had repeatedly taken the patient's ideas, embellished and repeated them without acknowledgement. The patient was under the impression he was hearing for the first time a productive idea without which he could not hope to master his own subject, an idea which he felt he could not use because it was his colleague's property. Among the factors determining the patient's inhibitions in his work, identification with his father played an important part. Unlike the grandfather, a distinguished scientist, the father had failed to leave his mark in his field of endeavor. The patient striving to find sponsors to borrow ideas, only to find that they were either unsuitable or could only be plagiarized, reproduced conflicts of his earlier relationship with his father. The projection of ideas to paternal figures was in part determined by the wish for a great and successful father, a grandfather. In a dream, the Oedipal conflict with the father was represented as a battle in which books were weapons and conquered books were swallowed during combat. This was interpreted as the wish to incorporate the father's penis. It could be related to a definite phase of infancy when, age 4 and 5, the little boy was first taken as father's companion on fishing trips. The wish for the bigger fish, the memory of exchanging and comparing fishes was recalled with many details. The tendency to take, to bite, to steal was traced through many ramifications and disguises during latency and adolescence until it could be pointed out one day that the decisive displacement was to ideas. Only the ideas of others were truly interesting. Only ideas one could take. Hence, the taking had to be engineered. At this point of the interpretation, it was waiting for the patient's reaction. The patient was silent, and the very length of the silence was a special significance, had a special significance. Then, as reporting a sudden insight, he said, "Every noon when I leave here before luncheon and before returning to my office, I walk through X Street, a street well known for its small but attractive restaurants, and I look at the menus in the windows. In one of the restaurants, I usually find my preferred dish, fresh brains."
Yes.
Should I continue?
Just a little bit more, yes.
It is now possible to compare the two types of analytic approach. In his first analysis, the connection between oral aggressiveness and the inhibition in his work had been recognized. A patient who during puberty had occasionally stolen mainly sweets or books retained later a certain inclination to plagiarism. Since to him, activity was connected with stealing, scientific endeavor with plagiarism, he could escape from these reprehensible impulses through a far-reaching inhibition of his activity and his intellectual ventures. The point which the second analysis clarified concerned the mechanism used in inhibition activity. The second set of interpretations, therefore, implemented the first by its greater concreteness. by the fact that it covered a large number of details of behavior and therefore opened the way to linking present and past, adult symptomatology, and infantile fantasy. The crucial point, however, was the exploration of the surface. The problem was to establish how the feeling "I am in danger of plagiarizing" comes about. The procedure did not aim at direct or rapid access to the id through interpretation. There was rather an initial exploratory period during which various aspects of behavior were carefully studied. This study started on a descriptive level and proceeded gradually to establish typical patterns of behavior, present and past. Noted first were his critical and admiring attitude of other people's ideas, then the relation of these to the patient's own ideas and intuitions. At this point, the comparison between the patient's own productivity and that of others had to be traced in great detail. Then the part that such comparison had played in his earlier development could be clarified. Finally, the distortion of imputing to others his own ideas could be analyzed and the mechanism of give and take made conscious. The exploratory description is aimed, therefore, mainly at uncovering a defense mechanism and not at a neat content.
Okay. Luis, thank you so much. Hope you have a little more air left.
Yes, I do.
Okay, it's a very nice reading, and I think Luis introduced us to the case in a very compelling way. This is a case study, basically, a psychoanalytic case study presented by Kris. And, this particular case study, as you can read it, demonstrates several conceptual distinctions that some of you might have noticed between the form of psychoanalysis that was developed in the United States after the Second World War, and, the perspective that we are introducing ourselves in this lecture series, which is, a Freudian one, or at least a Freudian one in as much as Lacan would consider it Freudian. So this case, I think, is fruitful ground for continuing our engagement with the conception of reality in psychoanalysis. And I can tell you that Jacques Lacan was very interested in this case and presented it in several of his lectures, and also in a paper that I think is one of his most fantastic papers that he wrote about psychoanalytic practice, which is called The Direction of the Treatment and the Principles of Its Power. And you can also find it in his first seminar, in his third seminar, and there are extensive commentaries about Lacan's commentary on this case, one of which, and I see here some faces from London that might know of some commentaries that have been also recently written in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis. We also have some representatives from the editorial board here today. And that sort of struck a certain dispute between several schools of Lacanian psychoanalysis today. So it's an extremely interesting case. And I can also tell you that there is a book that has just been published about it by a good friend of mine called Fernando. And if you're interested, I'll give you the citation later on. We have to take into account and to acknowledge that Ernst Kris, in the history of psychoanalysis, has been quite a unique psychoanalyst who, Lacan says, has developed a particular sensitivity due to his background in art history. So he is an intellectual, an art historian, and Lacan comments that he engages with a case in somewhat of a unique manner. And he takes up this case that we call today the case of the man who ate fresh brains. And as we saw in this paper, he explicitly states that he is the second analyst of this man. And it is a very interesting case because two very famous analysts have worked on it. There is Kris, and then, well, previously, this woman that was the analyst of the patient here is Melita Schmidberg. And she is a Slovakian-born psychoanalyst who worked mainly in New York and London. And her work mainly focuses on juvenile delinquency. And I don't know if you've noticed that Kris comments on this at some point in his case description. We see in this case a subject who is inhibited in his intellectual life. Right? It is an academic that cannot bring himself to publish his work because of an uncontrollable urge to plagiarize. Right? And this is the subjective drama in this case. Today, we see that many times in academy, and also there's this term of imposter syndrome, and the idea that what you are writing is that you don't really have the knowledge. And here we also have someone that is inhibited in his academic work due to this particular belief. Now, maybe it's not surprising, and you can read more in Melita Schmidberg's description, that she saw this urge as being rooted in a particular, let's say, juvenile misconduct that the patient spoke about in his analysis, particularly when he was stealing candies and books as a child. And it is from this angle that she approaches the analysis of the unconscious conflict. Now, what we see in this paper, and we see this many times in case descriptions that are sometimes too good to be true, but this is how they're written many times. We see Ernst Kris, in a way, valorizing himself as someone who took up this case in accordance with a new interpretive dimension. He speaks about a novelty in his perspective, a perspective that is more methodological. And he says that you can find that in the rest of the paper, if you read the whole paper, because it's not only this case description, it's all other case descriptions as well. You see that Kris says that his methodology goes from the surface level to the depth of the unconscious. Now, this is a very much non-Lacanian way to look at things, because for Lacan, psychoanalysis is not depth psychology. The unconscious is not something that is hidden, dark, deep. And an analysis is not an analysis of a hidden, dark place. For Lacan, the surface is where the work happens, and we'll see that in the end of the session today. So we also see in the paper, I'll contextualize this a little bit historically as well, that Kris attributes this novel interpretive perspective to the school of ego psychology, to Heinz Hartmann's school of ego psychology, which was an extremely trendy post-Freudian pedagogy of the time, let's say. And as you see, many case presentations, they are many times presented as being too good to be true, where things just work out for the analyst, so it seems. In the case presented by Kris, there is a central point, a central moment where he argues that he provides a new insight that supposedly changes the perspective on the case and provides a new starting point. Anybody has some intuition or idea what is this turning point in the case for Kris? We can open a discussion or hear some suggestions before I just proceed. Where does it happen in the case? And again, we are somewhat doing a supervision of the case here. And when one goes to supervision, they have to account for their interventions. In a way, if we use Lacanian terms, one has to account for their own jouissance and the way that it affects the patient's unconscious. So now we want to find in Kris's case a point of intervention that was clearly very important for him, and to ask him, why did you do that? So I see Dee raising her hand. Dee, did you find that place in the paper?
I thought that the moment when he said, so it's discovering a need and then finding the feeling associated with it is where it almost says what he was trying to do. So that was my perspective.
It is an interesting comment, because you are again focusing on the dimension of the need here. And in a way, you are continuing Melita's work. But Kris is saying, oh, I'm actually not interested in the id's impulse, if it is explicitly stated there, but in a certain form of defense. So it's a very good suggestion, and I agree, it is an important moment. But I wanted to find maybe someone to try and find the moment that Kris himself points out as a crucial moment in the analysis. This is a crucial intervention. So we have Ananya. Maybe we can hear you out.
Hi, I'm from India. I'm a candidate. While listening to the case, I thought that the part where he discovers, and it struck me because I didn't know how he discovered or who discovered that the work that was found in the library by a senior person who had impressions from his own work. It struck me as very curious that how did that realization occur? That was it a part of his own, meaning was it his own work, or was it that other person's work?
So you're speaking of the moment where the patient is discovering something? I'm not sure what point you're...
There was a mention in the pages about this point where he finds a thesis which is similar to his work, and there is a confusion whether this professor took work from the patient, whose idea was it? There's a confusion. Who took the idea from that point?
That's a very common confusion among the academics, by the way. Who said it first? But then again, I want you today, the listeners, to point us to a moment of intervention. An intervention that, I'll just say it, has a lot to do with what we're speaking about today. Kris makes an intervention. He makes an intervention on the level of reality. Anyone notices where that happens? Hilda, let's hear you out.
I have to confess, I didn't read it recently, but I think the analyst was looking himself in the book, or he asked his analyst to check in the book. But that was the thing he did. No?
Right. Exactly. This is the unique intervention that I wanted to focus on at this point. We see Kris listening to the patient speaking about himself being a plagiarist. Now, Kris listens to that, but he is not satisfied with what the patient is saying. And here, I think that, I think that even Lacan agrees with this. We should commend Kris for that. You should say, way to go. You didn't take things at face value in this sense, and he wants to further explore that question. What Kris does when he hears that the patient steals ideas from a particular paper, Kris can get his hands on this paper and he goes to check. He's an academic. He goes to check, is he really a plagiarist? He's going to find out. Now, there's a certain point of disagreement in reading the case study itself. And you can see some publications about that. Because some scholars, among them Lacan, argue that Kris actually goes to the library to read the paper to make sure that the patient was in fact plagiarizing. And he goes to the library and he reads it and he verifies that this is not the case. Others think that Kris was questioning the patient about the paper itself, trying to ask him to provide the exact lines that entailed the plagiarism, and then by listening to the patient, deciding if there was in fact a plagiarism. In any case, and I invite you to read the paper yourself and to decide, but in any case, we must agree that Kris was in fact questioning the patient about the reality of his plagiarism. But it was a particular type of reality that had to do with him being a scholar. It means that Kris was trying to get out to the world where the facts are all there for us to see and to come to a conclusion. The patient didn't really plagiarize anything. And this is the conclusion that he reaches. Now, when Kris discovers that the patient, in fact, did not really plagiarize, at least not according to the accepted academic rules, he then provides an interpretation that takes that into account. Again, I'm going to ask you, can anybody pinpoint this interpretation that follows Kris's intervention in reality? We've seen so far that I don't bite always, so you can give it a try if you wish. We're really delving deeply into this case study today. Roshni, please.
I mean, of course, I'm not sure about it, but I wonder if it's the point where he makes the Oedipal interpretation about books being the bigger fish and the oral aggressivity. Maybe it is kind of played in that symptom. Maybe
that's an interesting one, right? As well as him saying something of it being a substitute for the grandfather's, the father's phallus.
Yeah, exactly. Father's
which are sort of very brute kind of interpretations that I always, as some of you know, I'm very interested in autism in psychoanalysis, and it's always interesting to hear about Melanie Klein giving these brute interpretations to young children. Yes, it's actually the father's penis that you're after. I think it's a very interesting interpretation there, and we'll speak about it later, but I'm specifically looking for the one that followed Kris's intervention in reality. The one that sort of, the intervention was the precursor for this interpretation. Without it, Kris would not have reached this conclusion. It is the fact that he found out that this man is really not a plagiarist that enabled him to make this interpretation. So I'll wait a little bit more and then I'm going to spoil it. Here we go. Let's have Ananya again.
The part where, I think that's, I was trying to get it earlier as well, that this, he says that, once that this clue, when he says this clue was secured, that the patient had made the author say what he wanted to say himself. That part.
But where is the interpretation? This is what I'm searching for right here. Today is somewhat of an exercise in reading case studies. So where do you find the decisive interpretation following this intervention? It is the point where Kris tells the patient about the source of his plagiarism. He explains the plagiarism. Rochdi, you want to?
Is it about the question of the mastery, the problem of whether he masters the subject or not? So it becomes like it's kind of a technical problem, just of mastering the subject, but not really related to, maybe an address in the symptom.
Let's see. I'm not sure if that's the exact section, but let's see. Let me reveal the answer to this very, let's say, a very small and closed question. It is an interpretation that I think at face value also seems quite aesthetic, but we'll try and understand its mechanics. So after Kris makes sure that the patient is not really a plagiarist, he tells the patient that he wishes to be a plagiarist, and he keeps on thinking about it compulsively in order to prevent himself from writing anything. And in this sense, he defends himself from ever becoming one in reality. You see this sort of interesting kind of mechanics behind this interpretation, right? You wish to be a plagiarist. So the patient complains about it, and Kris interprets it as a wish, but he says that this wish, and he also addresses it as a compulsive wish, is actually what enables him not to write anything. And in this sense, he defends himself from ever becoming a plagiarist in reality. You don't write, there's no risk of being a plagiarist. So you keep on thinking you're a plagiarist, so you don't write anything, and then you don't become a plagiarist. A defense. Now, what Lacan says here, and this is a commentary that for Lacan is not very flattering. He says that what Kris is doing here is analyzing the defense before analyzing the drive, which is commonplace today. But in Lacanian psychoanalysis, what is at stake, let's say, what is the kernel of one's work at many steps of the analysis, in many places in the analysis, is the latter. The drive that has to do here, in this case, with an appetite for other people's ideas. Now, basically what we see here is Kris interpreting the patient's inhibition as a defense. And this is rooted in a certain assumption that is very fundamental in the school of ego psychology that Kris belonged to at the time. And this is the assumption that the drive and the ego's defense mechanisms share the same kernel. And in this sense, that the latter is molded in the shape of the former. Now, Lacan calls this a genetic approach to psychoanalysis. Maybe we can say it is somewhat of a developmental approach. And what we see in this paper is this approach being implemented. Now, if you want to read more about this, there is a paper written by Hartmann called The Genetic Approach in Psychoanalysis. So this is a paper from 1945 called The Genetic Approach in Psychoanalysis, and you can read all about this approach in this paper. I'll briefly mention that this approach, the genetic approach, it seeks to explain psychological phenomena by investigating their origins in the process of what is called psychosexual development. So people that abide by this perspective, they begin by looking at the phases of libidinal development that Freud laid out when he attempted to ground his concept of the oral, anal, phallic, and genital drives. And this is an attempt to, let's say, ground these in a biological framework. And by doing that, associating them with different defense mechanisms that are supposedly related to these phases of natural development. Now, through this process, or this kind of procedure, when paying attention to this procedure, analysts that abide by this perspective mainly focus on the analysis of the defenses that the patient presents. And because they forcefully assume an adequacy between these developmental stages and the defense mechanism, they then deduce a notion of a normal, and I'm using here scare quotes, it's a normal pattern of development, and they come to treat patients that do not abide by this pattern and need to be adapted to it. By the way, I'll just say this as a side note, because Anna Freud is the one that is very much mostly associated with the notion of defense mechanisms, but Anna Freud attempted to assess the relationship between stages of development and defense mechanisms, and she explicitly says that she didn't find any empirical evidence for that. But this school, or this genetic perspective, the perspective of Hartmann, at the heart of ego psychology in the US at that time, postulated this type of relationship. So when we understand that this is where Kris is coming from, this is why he analyzes the defense before he analyzes the drive, let's try and criticize his specific type of intervention and interpretation. And when we read Lacan reading Kris, we see that Lacan is arguing that Kris was wrong in exactly the point where he thought that he is most right. So he was wrong exactly. What is wrong in his intervention is exactly what he thought affirms his interpretation. And this is the fact that when he presents this patient with, and you'll read these words in the case study, with a change of perspective, right? You'll find the relevant part by searching these words. You'll see that Kris reports what happens right after. Right? You can go to the case study and see it right now. Kris says that the patient becomes silent for a moment and then, well, answers that for some time he has been frequenting fine restaurants after sessions, searching the menu for his favorite dish, which is fresh brains. And this is how Lacan sees things. What Lacan says is that this is an explicit testimony by the patient, that doesn't so much affirm the value of Kris's interpretation, but it corrects it through a self-reporting of his own acting out. He is acting out in his search for fresh brains. Now, before we proceed, I'll say a little bit about acting out. Okay, because many of you might know this term and know it, I think, colloquially or among psychologists as a term that describes a problematic or aggressive behavior that a patient exhibits in the praxis. So this is kind of the colloquial understanding of acting out. But acting out is actually a very psychoanalytic term that was used by Freud, and it's much more nuanced than that. Acting out for Freud is the idea that when the unconscious cannot speak, that usually happens when the analyst does not provide a place in the transference for it to speak. In these cases, the patient acts out what was not permitted to be spoken. And this means two things. First, it is usually acted rather than spoken. So what is not spoken, what cannot be spoken, is acted. And second, it is acted out, meaning it takes place outside of the analytic work, which is speaking freely. So acting out then is not just, a term for us to call patients that treat us in a not so nice way and sort of have a laugh among each other. Acting out is a very important sign for the analyst that they are mishandling the transference. Lacan calls this the resistance on the side of the analyst. And at some point, Lacan says that there is only resistance on the side of the analyst in psychoanalysis. That resistance spoken as though coming from the place of the analysand is a very redundant concept. But this is a resistance on the side of the analyst in as much as it is a resistance to the particularity of the symptom that is expressed usually in interpretations that force the analyst's point of view on the analysand rather than letting the analysand freely associate. So again, analysts among us in the group today, remember that for Freud, acting out is a sign that you must make note of because it will tell you that you are barking up the wrong tree. Now, why is the patient here acting out? Well, what Lacan says, and I'll try and implement his wittyful play of words here. Lacan says that the condiment that the patient indulges himself with after dinner seems to hint to the analyst that the main course was lacking. This is a play of words, some kind of an allegory, right? The patient searches for some spice, something to let him indulge in a speech that carries something of the body. And he does that after dinner, right? He doesn't do it during dinner, during the analytic session. And he does that in order to hint to the analyst that whatever he's serving in terms of his interpretations is actually lacking. So he goes and he eats something extra. He goes and he sniffs around restaurants for fresh brains. And for Lacan, this is a transitory phenomenon, meaning it is something, some type of a, let's say, transmutation of the symptom that happens during analysis. It wasn't there beforehand. It happened during analysis. It was developed during analysis. And Lacan says it was developed as an acting out that tries to inform the analyst that he is barking up the wrong tree. Now, Kris, open the paper, you'll see this. Kris thinks exactly the opposite. He thinks this shows me that I was right. But for Freud, the case would be read a little differently. And here our distinction that we have developed last time, and we will implement in a way today, this distinction between the imaginary idea of an objective reality on the one hand, and the psychoanalytic notion of psychic reality. Well, this distinction comes in handy right here in order to, well, know how to direct treatment and, well, make sure that it does not become a wild analysis. Now, what is important here in this case is not in terms of, let's say, in terms of this reality, of the concept of reality in this case. What is important is not to make sure that the patient does not steal in objective reality. It is useless to make this differentiation, you know, to find out what is originally his, what belongs to his colleague, who stole what from whom. These are distinctions that are almost impossible to make. First, because all scientific work relies on other works for its development. And further, the mere notion of plagiarism is considered to be negative only inside a set of symbolic coordinates and agreements. So, for instance, you know, poets can reference each other. If you listen to hip-hop artists, you know that they make music using other music. They sample music. Well, here we don't see it as a plagiarism. It is not negative. It is an art form. So going out there and telling the patient you are a plagiarist or not, well, is practically useless. What is interesting in terms of the patient's psychic reality is the fact that in his psychic reality, the patient steals nothing. Nothing being here in his psychic economy, exactly something that is so much worth stealing that he spends the whole day thinking about it. But again, if we do trust Kris in his meticulous academic inquiry, and I do trust him as an academic, what is this something if it is not the idea of others? What is this something that is worth stealing, that is on the patient's mind, if it is not the ideas of others, because he doesn't steal the ideas of others? What is he so interested in? It's a very difficult question. I can pose it at this point, and maybe we have some ideas or intuitions from the participants today that you want to share. I'll just briefly say, and if someone wants to raise their hand, Ufti, excellent. We'll hear you in a second. You know, Freud had a theory called seduction theory very early on in his teaching. And this is the idea that, well, many, let's say, symptomatic formations originate in a moment of sexual seduction. Today, we would say sexual abuse. And he would speak to his patients in an attempt to find this moment and sort of find a moment that happened in their lives. And very quickly, even before the turn of the century, he discovered that that is not so useful because many times memories that one recounts are false, or one invents memories that have nothing to do with any part of their biography. And then he didn't, we talked about it last time, he didn't completely abandon the question of memory and, let's say, a certain originating moment, a moment of fixation. But he said that when he thinks about memory, he thinks about it more as an entity, a locus that develops and changes and transmutes as one, let's say, goes on in their lives. So for Freud, it was important to know what one's reality is, not because it is real, but because it is there and was developed for some reasons. Freud was trying to trace back these formations, these unconscious formations. So again, it is not about the reality of the plagiarism that is so interesting to us. It is the central place that it takes in the subject's subjective life. And then we must ask ourselves, because we do follow Kris here, if it is not ideas that he is stealing, what is he stealing? So let's hear Rohti.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to start maybe with a question about what is it that Kris did wrong in his intervention at the level of what he considered to be a reality, maybe then go on to wonder what is he looking for. I was wondering if we could say that maybe his mistake is to really consider himself not the subject supposed to know, but the one that actually knows what is real and what is not. And by doing so, by saying, no, you're not stealing ideas, he kind of bears the lack at the locus of the other, where maybe the symptom of the subject kind of tries to ask a question. Because when he asks the question of plagiarism, it's you said in the academic world, maybe in the history of thought, no one has the first idea ever. It's always like in a dictionary, it's an idea referring to another idea in an infinite way. And so maybe raising the question of, is this idea really mine? He's asking the question of like the original, I don't know, point that holds the whole maybe structure of academia or knowledge. He wants to be truly first and original, to identify maybe with him. It's a bit confused, but this is kind of the thoughts I was having.
The idea of all ideas. Yeah. Exactly the idea that doesn't exist. You know, Schreber wanted to be the woman of all women, not a woman, but the woman of God, the wife of God. So it is a very unique, let's say, idea that we're talking about here. And I think Rushdie, that was a very good intuition here. And it takes us back. I might say this, it's important to give some credit to some other analysts here. It takes us back to Schmidberg, actually. The fact that she was on to something when she was treating this patient. You know, Kris engages with this question briefly when he argues that Schmidberg confused the analysant's childhood delinquency with the id. Right? She was thinking that something of the unconscious drive of the analysant to steal candy has to do with the question of plagiarism here. Now, when we read Lacan's interpretation, we see that he says she was actually onto something there, and he tells us to actually read the title of her paper on this case in order to catch his drift. And how is her paper called? Intellectual Inhibition and Disturbances in Eating. We see it in the title, and Kris completely missed that out. Some of you might have an idea what I'm talking about already, right? It is the fact that Kris addresses the patient as an obsessive, yes? But the patient gives him a huge hint with his fantasy about eating fresh brains. Now, this could have helped Kris, according to Lacan, to truly be revolutionary. He would have been able, Lacan says, to predate his contemporaries and work with a more precise diagnosis of anorexia, and particularly anorexia mental. This is a term that was used at the time. And what I will tell you here, again, contextualizing this historically, is that thinking of anorexia as an obsession with the body image only began a decade after the publication of Kris's paper. So Lacan was saying here, look, you could have actually been the one to speak about it, because you saw it. It was right in front of your face. The patient was screaming it at you. And if you would only paid attention to what the previous analyst like Melita Schmidbeck has done, you might have picked up the scent. And by doing so, you might have refreshed these two terms in psychoanalysis, anorexia and the mental. And these two terms, if you know a little bit about psychopathological classification today, they have been reduced to an etiological definition. Right? Today, anorexia is an eating disorder that is caused by the mental. Right? It is an eating disorder of the organism, of nourishment, that is caused by the mental. This is where the concept has been reduced to. In this sense, it's been reduced to a marker of an underlying cause for a physiological phenomenon. But for Lacan, Kris's case is an opportunity to identify anorexia as being, in its essence, mental. It belongs to the mental, and it manifests as an eating disorder proper only in a secondary way. So in this sense, we see that it is a psychic category. It is a structural category and not an etiological one. So we take a step today, a step with Lacan, a step away from reality, a step away from objective reality, the one that Kris took us on, a step towards the subject's own psychic reality, what one says, regardless to its, let's say, veridical value in the objective world. We take a step towards anorexia, and we ask then, what is anorexia if it belongs to the mental? So you might not be surprised to hear that for Lacanians, anorexia is a way to do with desire. It is a way to do with desire that can be furnished using an assortment of ideas. Many ideas can come to life on the basis of this particular way of doing with desire. Now, in our case, it was the idea of fresh brains. In other cases, it is the idea of a regimen of starvation. But first, there is a desire. And the idea is superimposed on it to function sometimes as a compromise between conflicting psychological factors or drives. So if we view it in this way, we see that the symptom itself, and this is quite Freudian here, the symptom itself is an expression of a compromise and can be seen as a manifestation of both the drive and the prohibition. But we start with the drive. Well, then, what is not eating? Or we might say better, eating nothing. Or we even will say, in a better way, eating the nothing. How is eating the nothing a solution to an inhibition, to not expressing a desire that is problematic? We see that when we view it in this way, we see that it is rooted in a specific point in the subject's life where a particular desire comes to the fore, but it is prohibited from realizing itself. And anorexia is a way of compromising with this relationship between the drive and prohibition. I'll get into this a little bit more, but I'll just say that it is only after we understand anorexia in this way that we can start thinking about, well, anorectic people who are thin and sickly, and put Kris's patient on the same boat. Because their refusal to eat has a symbolic origin that has to do with the nothing as an object. We might even say the nothing as an object cause of desire that causes this rejection. And it is only in this way that we can relate to the patient's aversion from his own ideas. So let's try and take one step further. We know that in the case of obsession, one wishes to cancel out the other and remain a cause for themselves. This is a way to think about obsessional patients. They don't really need you. This is why you see them very late in their lives. They can solve their own problems. Maybe today you can give them some tips, some exercises, and they will use them. Maybe you have some homework for them. I don't know if some of you might relate to these comments that we hear from patients sometimes today. No homework. Yes, your homework is not to do homework today. You can say sometimes, which is very difficult for the obsessive. For the obsessive, self-determination, complete self-determinacy is a very strong fantasy. And well, some of the most difficult work that we do with obsessive analysis in the beginning of an analysis is getting them to acknowledge a place that is beyond their control. And then they can start questioning this place. Now, on this note, on the similar note, we might say that the patient here, in this case, cannot conceive of an idea exactly because he rejects the domain of knowledge beyond himself as a source for an original idea. So it is only him. He wants an idea that is only his, that has nothing to do with the other, with the place of the other, with the social bond, with the place of academic exchange, let's say. Now, we said all ideas have a holding in other ideas. Now, the patient insists on having his own idea, and in this sense, he attempts, at least in his fantasy, to gain access to something that we might call a pure idea. A pure idea that has nothing to do with other ideas. And the nothing is exactly a pure idea. And then the idea that is a nothing is a pure idea. It has nothing to do with any other idea. But, well, it cannot really be found. What is an idea that is a nothing? Many of you might have some associations right now with sort of fantasies of annulment, well, on the other side of infinity. But again, when we think about an idea that is a nothing, we cannot find it. In this case, in this sense, we can conceive of it as an overvalued idea, as an ideal, as an impossible idea. Something that is, again, a very characteristic of obsessive desire, an impossible desire, a desire for impossibility. Now, fantasy for the neurotic works in such a way that one attempts to gain a certain relationship with an impossible idea in relation to an obstacle. So one can only have a relationship with, let's say, perfection when there is an obstacle on the way to perfection. The obsessive obsesses about being perfect, about achieving perfection, and complains about the obstacle that does not allow them to reach this perfection. Without this obstacle, there will be no place for perfection in one's libidinal economy. This is how fantasy works. It has to keep us at a distance from the object of fantasy. And this might be very clear to you, when you go shopping online. You have a little fantasy about the iPhone that you'll buy or the laptop that you'll buy, and you say, oh, this will change my life. I'm going to have that, I'm going to buy that, and it's going to be so amazing that from now on, I'm going to finally fulfill my potential. Another obsessive fantasy. But when you buy the laptop, and it's great, it's beautiful, you start using it, and you realize that actually that's not the case. And the fantasy is deflated. Now, neurotics are clever enough to find a way around this. They find ways to fabricate fantasies that have an obstacle that is not removable, but that they refuse to remove. And as long as the obstacle is there, I can keep, let's say, fantasizing and achieving some satisfaction in relation to an impossible object, to an ideal object that I valorize, an object that gets its value only because there is an obstacle in the way to it. The moment I take the obstacle away, the fantasy evaporates. So a good fantasy, you might say a good neurotic fantasy, is a fantasy where the obstacle is very hard to dismantle. If the object is easy to dismantle, it is not a very good fantasy. And it is very dangerous. I have spoken to some analysts that this experience of the deflation of the object of fantasy, this experience of receiving the new iPhone has caused them great distress, a period of depressed mood, because the fantasy has failed to supply them with the supposed satisfaction. Now, what we see in this case is something similar, but we have to note that the object here is unique. And here I'll just say, for Lacan, there is the drive, and the drive is always partial, because there is no drive that, let's say, fulfills our sexual satisfaction. There is no real satisfaction. Let's say Lacan says there is no sexual relationship. Basically, one cannot enjoy the other person. One enjoys through fantasy. And even when we have sex with others in a physical way, let's say, we do that via fantasy. When someone comes and complains to you in the clinic about their incapacity to function sexually, many times the problem is their incapacity to fantasize. So Lacan speaks about the drive, the sexual drive, in relation to its partial manifestations. And this is what you know from Freud, the oral, the anal. Now, Lacan took off the list the phallic and the genital, and he added two more, the scopic drive, the one that has to do with the gaze. It's a very strong and dominant drive in today's society. And the invocatory drive, which has to do with the voice. At a certain point, he also speaks of the object nothing. He says that the object nothing is one type of a partial drive object. And in this case, this is what he says. We see a case where the subject's libidinal economy revolves around an object, nothing. And the obstacle to this object is the idea, the brain. The patient is fresh out of ideas. So that he could flesh out the nothing, that is, to give it some flesh, he has to find an obstacle. And this obstacle provides the patient with access to a particular type of satisfaction, a satisfaction in relation to the object nothing. So in a way, he gets his way, like many anorectic patients, they get their way to eat the nothing. They find the way to eat the nothing. Now, at this point, I'll mention something that was already mentioned. I think, Roshdi, you mentioned it yourself, something in terms of the origin of the symptom. And this is something that we're interested in an analysis. We'll be interested to investigate further, right? Well, what is the moment where this compromise was made? What are the transmutations that we can trace back down to this moment? And with this case, it's hard to say, right? Kris does mention that the patient's father had a problem conceiving of new ideas. You can find it in the paper. So we might ask, maybe, could this have been some type of Oedipal identification with his position as an academic nothing? Could be. Lacan actually concentrates on the grandfather. And, well, what Kris says is that the grandfather of the patient is known for his ideas. He's known to be a great scientist. And the father, on the contrary, is not in comparison to the grandfather. So he states that Kris is actually correct in noting that the signifier grand, this word grand, which is included in the familial term grandfather, could be the origin for the patient's rivalry with his own father. And we see this in the little story about the fishing, right? Who will get the bigger fish? We saw this in the case presentation. This is a memory that the patient recounts about going on a fishing trip with his father. And he then recounts that he had a wish to catch a bigger fish in comparison to his father. And that was a very memorable event for him. Lacan saying the fish might stand here for the nothing that the father was for the patient. A way to catch the nothing, fry it, and give it a bite. So we're reaching the end of our session. I'd like to have a discussion as well. So I'll summarize. And what I want to say in preparation for next time, where we will have a lot of fun speaking about another very important case in the history of psychoanalysis. Should I tell you? Let's see. Okay, let's see. We see in the way that Kris progresses in this analysis, we see that there's nothing in common between this mode of action and the way that Freud suggests to progress when situating the subject in his reality. Kris goes on and addresses an objective reality from the outside, putting an end to the analysant's capacity to freely associate something in relation to his own subjective reality, to this drive to eat nothing. On the other hand, what we will see next time, when we engage with Freud's famous case of Dora, we will see how Freud actually does something that is opposite. And we call this type of reality, situating the subject in a reality, we call it in the Lacanian orientation, subjective rectification. Subjective rectification in Freud's method is something that is not empirical. It is dialectical. It does not go out to the world and make sure that the analysant actually says something true. It goes out of the analysant's speech and comes back to it. It questions something about the subject's relationship to their own desire, putting it under question, putting their own involvement with it under question, rather than determining it, saying, you actually want to be a plagiarist because in that way you write nothing, and that enables you not to be a plagiarist at all. In a way, determining the analysant's desire rather than questioning it. So this means that subjective rectification has to do with the relationship between what, in this case, and in many other cases of obsession, we hear about a terrible world that that prevents the subject from reaching a certain ideal, and the beautiful soul, right, of the analysant themselves. So what we see is that this relationship between the terrible world and the beautiful soul is returned to the subject in an inverted form, using the subject's own discourse, not going out to the world, but using the words of the analysants. What is your role in this drama? Are you the victim of an uncontrollable fate having to do with a compulsion to plagiarize? Or is it your drive to eat the nothing that latches on the demand for fresh ideas? What is your stake in this whole ordeal? Why would you tailor your reality in this way? What makes it so attractive to you? Now, of course, these are not articulations to use, yes, but these are the questions that concern us when we rectify the subject in relation to their own reality. One must use the words of the analysant, not these words that I give you here, but these are some formulations that might put you on the right track. We have spent time thinking about Kris's case today because I think that we learn best from our errors. And the errors that psychoanalysts have made before us can then be used by us as, let's say, beacons for our own direction of the treatment. Now, when I speak about these interventions that are not interventions that tell the subject something about their desire, but these interventions that question the active involvement of one's fabrication of one's own reality, you probably know, and we will see this next time, that these interventions are many times not picked up so gladly by the analysant. And many times we receive a negative response. But again, something that I wanted to sort of convey to you today is that I believe that in psychoanalysis, we are not supposed to fish for affirmative subjective reactions. It is not about the analysant saying to us, oh, that's very interesting. Oh, that's a very good question. You know that there are some analysants that would always think that you're really great. It is not that we're fishing for, because that is not an actual clue to take on ourselves. We are fishing for an effect for the interpretation, an effect that would not be an acting outside of the analytic work, an effect that will take place within it, an effect that will impact one's free associations. So the question is, does it have an effect? Does the interpretation have an effect? And we never know it right away. We never know it. The analysant might laugh, and it might be a good point to end the session. The analysant might be surprised. The analysant might be quiet. We do not know. We will only know in the following sessions in the way that the free association has been affected. But, and this is very important for me to tell you today, this effect does not originate in an objective position that the analyst attempts to take. The effect does not rely on a type of objectivity that many practitioners and analysts associate with themselves and with their training. An analyst also has an unconscious. There is no way around it. Any type, and this is something that Lacan is very adamant in progressing, and I think is maybe, I think one of the most important characteristics of the Lacanian orientation today, and many people think it's the, variable sessions, the fact that a session is not the same time. That's a tool, that's a device. It is not an ethical position. But I think an ethical position that characterizes the Lacanian orientation is the idea that any type of objectivity is an abuse of power. Because, and Freud noted that already, in the transference, analysins are many times prone to suggestion. And this, well, is pointing out the fact that it is the surface which is at stake. Kris accidentally states something about it, but I mean, it is not the surface of the cold objective facts that is interesting to us. It is not what we can find on the surface when we go to reality. It is the surface of the language of the analysis. It is the speech. It is desire. It is the place where desire can be questioned. Something speaks there on the surface. And this is how desire still manifests, even when it is pushed down or hidden. And this is exactly what happened in the acting out, in Kris's case, of the man who ate brains, and a point that I hope has struck you today in some way and made you a little bit curious to learn more. So I'll end here. I'll stop here. And we have a few minutes for ruminations, intuitions, ideas. This stage is open. Yes, Uti.
Yeah, maybe just one word about the ethical position of the Lacanian analyst. Could we say it's like the suspension of disbelief in cinema or literature, where you just take the discourse of the patients as some kind of fiction, and it's not important whether it's true or not, or to check in the objective reality? Or maybe we could consider the objective reality as a form of language instead of being the end of itself. That was it.
It is tempting to speak of an utter suspension here, but in order to have an ethic, we have to believe in a truth. Yes, in this sense, not a truth as what is necessarily veridical, verifiable, but a truth is something that sets an ethics in place. And ethics is not only morality. Ethics is not. There's a difference between morality and ethics. Morality is about, the conduct of people, how we should behave, how, a society should be, etc. And ethics is any system that will direct one in a certain pursuit consistently. Yeah, and there is an idea that to psychoanalysis there is an ethics, because if there isn't, what are we doing here? There's a certain mode of therapy that's called narrative psychology, and it basically says that we speak with the patient and they invent a narrative about themselves. As long as it works for them, that's fine. For me, it's some kind of a type of a Woody Allen type of psychotherapy, whatever works. Yeah, but I think that in psychoanalysis, it's important to have a certain guiding let's say, star, coordinates, in order to responsibly partake on an analysis. And in this sense, what we're saying is we are suspending our engagement with objective reality. In the same way that we are suspending our engagement with, I don't know, our critique of capitalism. We had a very interesting talk with Stijn van Hulle a few months ago, and he was saying that outside of the praxis, he has certain opinions about capitalism, but inside he is very aware of the fact that capitalism might be a very important tool for some psychotic subjects for their stabilization. So it's an idea that we don't, truth for us is not something that we find out in some objective realm, but it has to do with one's unconscious, with the analysins unconscious. So it is an idea that there is something that we call an unconscious, and that we explore it in analysis. We work through something that is real. Real in this sense, in the fact that it is singular and particular, not because it is objective and generalizable. So I'd say, yes, we abandon the seduction theory, but we remain with an ethics that puts the unconscious at the core of the psychoanalytic pursuit. Thank you, Steve, for all your comments today, and I'll see you next time, hopefully. We have Catherine and Heather, and I think we'll end there. So Catherine, let's hear you out.
Thank you for today. I couldn't but help think when you talked about the patient wanting to eat the grandfather's penis, the phallus. You said that very early on. And I couldn't but help think when you talked about nothingness of Lacan's phallus, you have it, you don't have it. It's almost like an empty set, you know, that those diagrams he has where he has the subject with a slash through and it's empty. And I thought, well, that's it. Maybe he's eating the phallus, which can never be, because it came from a grandfather. It is and it isn't. And you go back through the father for the writing, for the ideas, and they're phallic, which means they're empty anyway. And I just thought there was something... I just couldn't but help think about that in terms of Lacan's being the phallus.
That's a very, very interesting intervention, Catherine. And I have to say that you are exhibiting a similar symptom to the man who ate fresh brains. You think you're a plagiarist, but you're not. I didn't say that. It was not me.
Right, okay.
But Kris does comment on it, as you've noted in his paper. He does comment about the penis, right? The penis of the father or the grandfather. I don't remember. And I think your comment is on point, because for Lacan, and it even will allow us to contextualize a little bit. You know, for Lacan, the phallus is not the penis. It is not the organ. And Lacan abandoned this idea that it is the organ that psychoanalysis must revolve around. For Lacan, the phallus is a signifier. The phallus is a signifier for lack. It is a signifier for desire, for what is desirous. And if you open Lacan's paper, the signification of the phallus, which can be also translated as the significance of the phallus, you see that Lacan says that the phallus only has its effect when it is veiled. He speaks about fantasy there, basically. The phallus has its power only when there's a veil that puts an obstacle between us and the phallus. And when it is opened, it's not as impressive as many men and women here probably have experienced and know from their own experience. So the phallus is a signifier for something that is supposedly there. There's always this idea, I don't know if you've watched these shows where they have these curtains, and behind curtain number 1 is something, behind curtain number 2 is something, curtain number 3 is something, and you're so excited when they choose the curtain to reveal it, and then they reveal a car or a donkey, I don't know, whatever show you were watching. And this is the idea that the phallus is a signifier for lack. And this is why I was commenting on this very briefly, that the object nothing is something that Lacan engages with at a certain point, but later on, he doesn't speak about it so much. He moves to speak about the phallus, right? The phallus as an object nothing. It is exactly a nothing behind a veil. So I agree with you, and I think it's an example for something that I always found puzzling, how in Kleinian case studies, and especially with Melanie Klein, I think she's a fantastic writer and had very good groundworks to her psychoanalysis. You see these most preposterous interventions that you like are about phalluses and mothers and fathers, but sometimes they just hit the spot. They make an effect. And something that Lacan explicitly says, and I very much agree with, is that many times it is not the ridiculous kind of Oedipal drama that is sort of forced on the subject that does the work, but actually the structure of one's saying. And I think that an interpretation like this might be exactly an interpretation like that. So yes, thank you for your comment, Catherine. We'll have Heather, and then I'll say goodbye. I'll say a little bit about next time, and we'll say goodbye.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting talk and a very interesting paper. And maybe just expanding on what Catherine was saying, I too was wanting to maybe think more about that moment in the paper when he had talked about wanting to incorporate something after that memory of the fishing and comparing with his father. And then it just did seem like somehow these things are connected, because it did seem that wanting to incorporate something from his father, he's wanting to take something in. And then somehow the oral aggression, I think it was very interesting how you set it up to say that this is the mistake that he's making. He's missing it here. And that when he goes and leaves to eat the brains, that his acting out is showing how the analyst is not getting it. He's going out there, it's an oral aggressive act to go out and consume these brains, but what do they symbolize, these brains? Is this a part of the analyst? Is this a part of the father or the grandfather? Is this what can't be written? Are they still going down somehow inside of him and he's holding on to them? Is this what would be written if he were to write something? It's very interesting to me because I am working with a young man who restricts and is anorexic and who does have issues with his father, and some Oedipal aspects there. And so he's an artist and he is a writer, he's a writer and filmmaker. And so I'm just trying to understand through the case. I wasn't as familiar with eating, not the eating of the nothing, and that was so helpful. And so, but I did think that there were some of these phallic elements, as Catherine was bringing up as well. So there's a lot there to think about, but I feel we didn't get as much into those brains. What was going on with those brains?
Because Heather, we just don't have the information.
Yeah.
Basically, what you are suggesting is exactly what Lacan was suggesting. Instead of engaging with comparison to objective reality, instead of going to see if the actually is a plagiarizing, asking exactly these questions is a way to go. This is what would be interesting psychoanalytically.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have a lot more information about that. It would have been helpful if you would given Kris a call at the time and told him maybe that's the case, given him some supervision.
Oh, well, my patient writes movies, and so I'm going to see if maybe I can get him to write a script about it or something. Maybe he can tell us more.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing with us. I hope to see you in the next session.
Thank you very much. It was so interesting.
Okay, so I'll just say thank you for all of you for bearing with me until now. Next time, we're going to talk about the Dora case, and we're going to really trace all the different dialectical moments in Freud's intervention in order to clarify a concept of subjective rectification in Lacanian psychoanalysis. So this would be somewhat of a alternative to the reality principle outside of the Lacanian orientation. So we'll try and close that up by thinking about Dora, and then providing you with some insight as to what Lacanian analysts do in these terms today. So that's what we're going to do next time. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.